Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at the first part of the Crimean War series by Extra History, and this is a topic that should be more well known but it isn't, and I know a bit more about this than the conquest of India, so hopefully I will be able to offer some more insight this time around. But without further ado, let's get going.
Jerusalem, Good Friday, 1846. Pilgrims and priests thronged the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, eager to pray at the site of Christ's crucifixion. Now, most of the time, Holy Week falls separately on the Catholic and Orthodox religious calendars, but this year they coincide and everyone's here at once. It's packed, and they're shouting. The Orthodox priests arrived first, putting their altar cloth on the altar. Then the Catholics, furious, try to yank it off and replace it with their own. Both insist they have a document from the Ottoman Sultan supporting their right, and suddenly a monk throws a punch. Within
I see
seconds,
where they're
the
going with
seething
this.
crowd are shoving and kicking, smashing each other with crucifixes and candlesticks. Turkish bodyguards hired by wealthy pilgrims lay in with clubs. A priest swings an incense burner like a morning star, and people start drawing pistols. By the time Ottoman troops regain control, 40 people are dead. Welcome to the start of the First Modern War. Don't forget, as soon as you're done watching this episode, episode 2 is already up a week early and ad-free over on Nebula. Stick around to the end for a teaser. The Crimean War is perhaps the most poorly named conflict in history. From its name, you might think that it was fought to settle a dispute over the Crimean Peninsula.
No, the Crimean War was not fought over the dispute of the Crimean landmass. It was about, curiously enough, like they hinted at the beginning of this video, about a disagreement over the rights of Christian minorities in Palestine, of all places. And that was the flashpoint of this whole conflict. Of course, there is a much wider sphere of interests involved in this matter, but yeah, it's a quite poorly named war, and I imagine he will tell us why.
It wasn't. Or you might assume that Crimea was the most important front of the war, but
Nope.
you'd be wrong again. Clashes also occurred along the Danube, in what's now Romania, in the Baltic Sea, and even in the far North Pacific. And though the land operations in Crimea are the most famous, it was the naval operations that actually won the war.
Yes, most of the land conflict took place in the Crimean Peninsula, and that's where most of the troops died and fought. So, yeah, that was you'd think that was the decisive battleground, but it was not. It was actually an Anglo-French fleet blockading St. Petersburg that sort of forced the Russians into a pretty bad peace agreement, on looking at their perspective at least.
In fact, historians have even proposed, mostly hypothetically mind you, that it be renamed the Baltic War or the Great Russian War or even World War Zero.
Now, there's one thing you gotta know about historians. Historians are pretty bad at naming wars, they're pretty unimaginative. We have the 7 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' War. You know, it's really not that imaginative. So, you know, no wonder they named this war the Crimean War, just because most of it happened to be fought in Crimea.
See, the Crimean War was fought all across Europe, with Russia facing off against an allied coalition including the UK, France, and the Ottoman Empire. But it was also the first truly modern war, a conflict that began looking like the Napoleonic past, but by its end presaged the industrial slaughter of World War I. It would be the first steam-powered war, the first telegraph war, the first war with photographs and war correspondence, and it would kill at least 500,000 people.
Now you have to remember that the Crimean War was the first major war fought in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. And the reason there had been this long of a stretch of peace in Europe, or relative peace at least, is because one, the great European powers were really exhausted after the Napoleonic Wars, and two, because a certain Austrian foreign minister at the time, Clemens von Metternich, established a so-called Concert of Europe, and what that meant was that the great European powers agreed to define clearly political boundaries and spheres of influence, and if any great power tried to overstep those boundaries, then the other great powers would intervene to stop them in their tracks. And this was to prevent another expansionist France or anyone like it ever happening again. And well, the system was quite successful, you could argue, early on, but by the time the Crimean War comes around, the system is crackling a bit. It was meant that any disputes were meant to be resolved diplomatically at a Congress, preferably, but if not, the other European powers would step in militarily to intervene. And that is sort of what happened here. Russia tried to overstep its bounds, and it got a. They were lashed out by the UK, France, and the Ottoman Empire.
And supposedly, it all started over who got to hold a pair of keys. Now, deadly brawls at holy sites, like the one in this episode's opening, were not unusual in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. For centuries, pilgrimage sites had flip-flopped between the Catholic and Orthodox churches based on whichever faction obtained a decree from the Sultan. But in 1757, the Ottomans finally had enough and decreed a status quo, in which all 6 Christian churches would receive access to the religious sites and shared responsibility for their upkeep.
Yes, the Ottoman Empire was a remarkably tolerant empire, and while the Christians were still, Christian minority was still second-class citizens, they were still, treated fairly good, and with that came a responsibility over the holy sites and, governing those sites and making sure that these denominations had access to it. And like they said, there had been an ongoing conflict here between primarily the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church, but who should have supremacy over these sites. And like they said, the Ottomans basically threw up their hand and declared a so-called status quo, a very famous decree, which, where they tried to make sure that all denominations had a say in how things should be governed. And if you know anything about Catholicism, or rather Christianity or religion, you know that there will inevitably be quite a few disputes. Just look at the dispute between the Protestant and Catholic denominations that resulted in a 30 Years' War that killed 7 million people. So now, that conflict was not all about religion, of course. I'm just simplifying here, but, getting 6 Christian denominations to agree to anything is, that would be quite the miracle. Let's just say that.
And to give you an idea of how seriously this is taken, get this. When the status quo was declared, it stated that nothing in a site could be changed without the churches all agreeing to it. And as you can imagine, getting full agreement proved nearly impossible. Hence, things like this happened. The day before the decree, a workman left his ladder at one of the churches, and it's been there ever since, to this day.
True story. There's actually a picture of it. You can just go and look it up on Google, whatever. Quite remarkable little story. But yeah, nobody has moved that ladder ever since. And I think it was placed in the mid-1700s.
Things became even more complicated when Catholic France, who mostly had custody of these sites via treaties, turned away from religion during the Revolutionary period, and Eastern Orthodox Christians stepped in to fill the power vacuum. Then, when the French returned to Palestine in the 1830s, a series of confrontations over the sites followed.
Yes, if you know anything about the French Revolution, you probably know that was a really anti-Christianization process going on during the early years of the revolution, where the Catholic Church was basically kicked out of France altogether and replaced with a secular state-sponsored religion, the cult of reason and the cult of the supreme beings. And well, Napoleon put a stop to this pretty quickly and restored relations with the Catholic Church, and eventually, the French wanted to get back into this get back into this and get control of these holy sites again. But the Eastern Orthodox Church had already stepped in and filled the gap, like they said.
Groups warred over who would get to fix structures, since maintenance legally implied ownership. Things got tense. In 1842, the Orthodox Church erected a wall in the Church of the Nativity, blocking Catholic access to the shrine of Jesus' birthplace.
Literally
5 years later,
blocking
they
them.
pried up a silver star that French Catholics had put there. But the nastiest conflict was over keys. By tradition, the Orthodox monks kept the keys to the church's front door, with the Catholics possessing a less prestigious key to an interior door. Angry at this slight, the two groups started a brawl in 1852 that killed several Orthodox monks. So in response to these worsening brawls, two men...
Aren't we humans fascinating creatures? We kill each other over who has the most prestigious key. Unbelievable.
...intervened in the conflict. Nicholas I, Tsar of Russia, and Napoleon III, recently crowned Emperor of France.
Yes, these are the two of the most important players at this time. Nicholas I, what can we say about him? He succeeded Alexander I, who of course won Russia, the Napoleonic Wars. And he's best described as a reactionary conservative monarch. He was very much against the French revolutionary reforms that had taken hold in much of Europe, much in part due to Napoleon's conquests. But Nicholas, what did he do before the Crimean War started? Well, he had focused a lot of attention on suppressing anti-revolutionary and reform sentiment, and doing so with violence. The December's Revolt is the most famous example of this, during the opening day of his reign, where a military coup happened against him. He managed to crush it. And ever since then, he has been quite paranoid about these revolutionary sentiments. He actually, during the 1848 revolutions, earns the nickname the gendarme, or policeman of Europe, because he helped the Austrian Empire crush the Hungarian Revolution. And what else? Nicholas I has focused a lot on territorial expansion. Russia is continuing its territorial expansion, mainly in the eastern parts of the empire, but still quite a lot of territorial expansion is done during Nicholas's reign. He also centralizes the Russian administration. And yeah, he is the perfect role model for an absolutist monarch, though absolutism has been on its way out for quite some time at this point. And then we of course have our good old friend Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon. He is often remembered as quite a dismal ruler. And of course, when he's being compared to his great uncle Napoleon, yeah, well, you can see he has a lot to live up to, and certainly Napoleon was no great military genius. He was a competent administrator. By all rights, his domestic reforms were quite important. The Great Reconstruction of Paris, the expansion of foreign trade. He doubled the size of the French colonial empire, so it was not all bad. But he is mostly remembered for his defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. And that has come to define his rule, and many of his foreign policy adventures were quite a failure. He tried to create a Mexican empire. Didn't go so well. His greatest foreign policy success is actually the Crimean War, and he was instrumental in helping to create the Kingdom of Italy. So those are the two players we have to work with.
But let's start with Nicholas I, who was largely responsible for starting the war. By 1852, Nicholas had been on the throne for 26 years and held sway over the fastest-growing empire in Europe. A military man, he grew up fascinated by his father's generals, dressed in impeccable uniforms, and slept on a cot.
Yes, Nicholas I fancied himself a soldier who was a bit of a martinet, overly fond of military drill, inspections, parades, and that is one of the features of him, one of the personality traits that led to the revolt on his opening day as the ruler of Russia. But yes, suffice it to say, he's quite the soldier character, or he fancies himself as such.
But perhaps Nicholas's most prominent feature was his near-religious belief in restoring the Russian Empire to its former glory. See, Nicholas believed that as the last Orthodox power, Russia was the heir of Byzantium.
Moscow has been called the Third Rome, though let's be honest here. Russia does not have any sort of real connection to Byzantium or Rome. Byzantium is, of course, the true successor to the Western Roman Empire, but Russia is definitely not the successor to the Eastern Roman Empire. I'm sorry, but that's just the truth. There's really not much connection that would legitimize such a claim.
And Rome. And as head of the Russian Orthodox Church, he considered himself the protector of Orthodox Christians worldwide, including in Ottoman territory, where they did indeed experience state-sponsored oppression and at times were massacred. He regularly backed Christian uprisings in Ottoman territory, such as the Greek War of Independence in...
Yes, Nicholas I was actually very instrumental in ensuring the Greek War of Independence was happened and was successful. So, if you're Greek, you probably appreciate that fact. But Nicholas I, and many other Russian rulers previously, have always fancied themselves as the defenders of Orthodox Christianity, and has used that as a pretext for invading numerous countries. Most of all, the Ottoman Empire. Every time Russia needs to invade, or wants to invade, the Ottoman Empire, they use the pretext of defending Orthodox Christians who are being oppressed. Now, like they said, there were some oppression, but not nearly enough that could justify this sort of large-scale war.
1821. This belief went hand in hand with Russia's expansionist policies, which had spent nearly a century taking bites out of Ottoman territory. Though often done with the stated goal of protecting Orthodox Christians, these were also about expansion south. Catherine the Great herself started this pattern by capturing the Crimean Peninsula and its warm water port of Sevastopol. That port gave Russia a path to the Mediterranean, provided they passed through Ottoman territory.
And this consideration, the warm water port and easy access to the Mediterranean, is still what governs Russian policy towards Crimea to this day, and as I'm sure you all know, Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014 from Ukraine. And one of the main strategic reasons for doing so is to get hold of the port of Sevastopol. Now, already before the annexation, the port of Sevastopol was being leased to the Russian Navy, but this was the direct annexation of it is not only a major strategic gain for Russia, but also Crimea has had a special place in Russian history as part of Novorossiya, New Russia, that was established by Catherine the Great, I believe. And so there's a lot of history behind this, and you can easily see the connections to modern-day conflicts.
These lands were not only important for reaching ports, though. Nicholas also feared the increasing liberalism of the West, which he felt would undermine Russia's autocratic policies, and he wanted a strong Russia with buffer zones to keep the West at bay. Yeah, and if this is all sounding a bit familiar, a lot of historians have pointed...
Oh, it sounds so familiar. Even, Putin, he talks about the dangers of Western values infiltrating Russian society, and that's why he has a strict policy against transgender and homosexuals, and it's the same pattern repeating itself in Russian history, I'm afraid.
Out the parallels to recent events. In fact, Crimea itself, while internationally recognized as part of Ukraine, has been occupied by Russia since 2014. Actually, though, now that we're on the subject, as a quick aside, it did feel wrong to do this series without at least mentioning the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine in today's day and age. One of the saddest aspects of which has been its impact on civilians. And to that end, myself and several of our team have made donations to Doctors Without Borders, who are providing treatment to civilians within Ukraine being affected by the war, ranging from emergency medicine to psychotherapy to medical evacuation. There They're also working with communities of displaced Ukrainians currently residing in neighboring countries as well. So if you'd like to chip in and you are able, we'll put a link in the description to where you can help them out with all of that. Sorry for interrupting the history. It just felt important and like it had to be done. But
I approve of this message.
I digress. Russian expansion during the 18th and 19th centuries vastly weakened the Ottoman state. And to Nicholas, there was only one way it would end. During a meeting with British officials in 1844, he referred to the Ottoman Empire as a sick man. A man died.
This is where Nicholas I coins the famous phrase, the sick man of Europe, to denote the inevitable and continuous decline of the Ottoman Empire. Now, whether the concept of sick man of Europe is true or not is still debatable. I myself don't think that I don't think there's such a thing as terminal decline. You know, if things had been different, perhaps the Ottoman Empire could have clung on to at least some parts of their empire. But regardless, this sick man of Europe theory spawned the so-called Eastern question. Maybe he'll mention it. The Eastern question that arose was that who would get what from the partitioned Ottoman Empire? Because the partition was inevitable, according to the European powers' thinking at least. And there was this great debate about who would get what. And of course, Nicholas, he wanted some chunks of the Ottoman Empire himself, if not all of it. So yeah, shows you that European imperialism is at full swing during this time.
And when that man died, he said, the powers would have to figure out what action to take. This became known as the Eastern
There
question.
we go.
What should Europe do about the seemingly crumbling Ottomans? Nicholas wanted to partition the Ottoman Empire, or, to have Russia take it over entirely. And he saw Britain as a potential ally in this, believing that the British would be happy to see the Ottomans fall, and that after any partition, they would naturally back Russia's claim over the holy sites. I mean, the UK wouldn't side with France, right? Especially not while it's governed by Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. Though in this line of thinking, he was vastly mistaken.
Yes, because even though it's Napoleon's nephew who's on the throne in France, reality is that states are more rational actors than we'd like to believe, and so if the UK and France's interests happen to align against Russia, they would join forces against them. And the UK in particular considered Russia to be a far greater threat than Napoleon III ever would be.
Turned out, Britain increasingly saw Russia as the danger, not France. Also at the time, Russia and Britain were engaged in sort of a Cold War.
Yes, they were. And this is called The Great Game, a 19th century version of the Cold War centered on Afghanistan, of all places, because Russia was expanding towards Afghanistan from the north, and of course Afghanistan is pretty close to British India, so you could see how these, particularly the British, feared that the Russians would keep expanding southwards, and that led to some interesting shenanigans over in the Middle East, but that's a story for another time.
Known as the Great Game, each trying to influence governments in
Central
Asia. The British government also harbored...
I feel like I'm getting the vlogging through history curse. I'm saying things and then he says it right afterwards. That's just how it goes, I guess.
Fears that Russia planned to move on India, and worried that if the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Russia's dominance of the East would upset the post-war Napoleonic balance of powers. In other words, the British were committed to keeping Turkey around as a check against Russia, and even supported that by pushing the Ottomans into a reform program meant to strengthen the state.
Yes, and that's important to remember. The British and the French and all of them, they didn't care about the Ottoman Empire, really. But they were a useful check on Russia's continued expansion. And as such, if need be, they would help the Ottoman Empire defend itself.
But Britain's biggest worry were Russian naval bases in Crimea. Using them, Russia could launch a strike against Istanbul.
Now it's important to remember here, for modern audiences, I understand that they've named the city Istanbul in this video, but I guess that's for modern audiences. In reality, the city was still named Constantinople, as it was before Constantinople. It was Byzantium before Constantine the Great renamed the city after himself. But the city still is Constantinople. It doesn't change its name until the Turkish Republic is declared around 1922-ish, I believe. They officially changed the name to Istanbul. So, just a small tidbit.
Before France or Britain could dispatch a fleet to defend it, effectively collapsing the Ottoman state at will. By contrast, on the other side of this religious issue...
And yes, Constantinople was a key city controlling access to the Mediterranean from the Black Sea, and Russian control of Constantinople would not be tolerated by the great powers of Europe. And we will also see in later interventions down the line that the Russians are forced out from the Ottoman Empire by the Congress of Berlin later on, about 20 to 30 years afterwards, I believe. So, yeah.
Was Napoleon III, who'd been elected the first president of France in 1848. However, then in 1852, he'd lost the election.
That's not entirely true, though. The problem for Napoleon III when he was elected president of the French Republic during the chaos of 1848 was that it was a single 4-year term he was limited to. And according to the constitution of the Second French Republic, he couldn't run for president again. He actually took the title of Prince President, if you can believe that. But yeah, that's the problem, and Napoleon actually tried to push through a constitutional amendment that would allow him to continue to run for the office of president. However, he didn't achieve the 2/3 majority required to push through the change, and as such, he decided to just do like his great uncle and do a coup and seize power for himself, declaring the Second French Empire, and here we are again.
And instead of conceding, just declared himself emperor. However, his coup was on shaky ground and depended heavily on the support of traditional Catholics. So,
yes, Napoleon III's reign is famously rocky, and he depended on a hodgepodge coalition of different groups in society, which led to some interesting reforms. But yes, Roman Catholics was probably one of the most important supporting groups Napoleon III had, and as such, he did everything he could to please them, including during 1848, when the Pope was ejected from the Papal States. Napoleon ensured that the Pope was put back on his throne, and that was more important to him than the Italian cause of independence and unification, even though Napoleon III actually was a strong supporter of Italian unification.
In an attempt to mollify this political bloc and bring France back to its international standing, he dispatched a famously confrontational diplomat to the Ottoman court in order to insist that a 1740 treaty granted France the right to govern holy sites. Then, when the Ottomans agreed with France, an equally inflammatory Russian ambassador countered with a claim based on treaties they claimed nullified that 1740 treaty. So now the Ottomans, fearing Russia might actually declare war, switched their position and granted them the holy sites. Not ready to back down and to prove a point, France then dispatched the 80-gun warship Charlemagne to sail into the Black Sea. A clear violation of treaties that stated warships could not do this in peacetime. Unable to resist this act of gunboat diplomacy, the Ottomans then switched their position again.
And here we can see the weakness of the Ottoman state at this time. They are quite powerless to resist the demands of these great European powers. And as they said, some good old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy will always ensure that you will get what you want. Gunboat diplomacy has been used by the British prolifically, but also the Americans. For example, they sent some gunboats to Japan to force them to open their ports and, stop their isolationist policies. So, Europeans, they are quite good at this sort of blackmail, you could call it.
Renaming France the protector of the holy sites, to which Russia responded with invasion. In July 1853, Russian troops surged across the Danube, occupying the territories of Wallachia and Moldavia, which were jointly governed by Russia and the Ottomans. And at this point, Nicholas considered the war as good as over, certain that Britain and France would not support the Turks against fellow Europeans. He was wrong again. On October 16th, the Ottomans, with the support of Britain and France, declared war on Russia. World War I had begun.
Yeah, Nicholas I, overall his reign was quite catastrophic in terms both domestically and especially foreign policy. He had some successes before this, but the Crimean War will really just destroy whatever he gained previously during his foreign policy adventures. So, yeah, Nicholas I, quite a mediocre ruler. Alright, I think we reached the end of the episode there. So, yeah, the Crimean War series looking good already, and I'm really looking forward to the next part, see what happens, what they will cover. But if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. If you have anything to add, please leave a comment. I read all of them. And I'll see you guys next time.